Hello, this is David Frothingham, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 22nd, 2026 issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The first headline on the front page of today's New York Times reads, "The night the government closed the skies over El Paso. A high-energy laser weapon and a power struggle between federal agencies brought a night of hassles to the city." This article is by Kate Kelly, Tonell D. Hobbs, and Reyes Mata III. Around 9 p.m. on February 10th, an air traffic controller at El Paso International Airport saw an alert pop up on the tower's computer screen. It was from the Federal Aviation Administration. The controller beckoned the two colleagues who were sitting nearby. Together they stared at the FAA advisory. In 2.5 hours, it said, a huge slice of the airspace they handled would close for special security reasons. For 10 days. The controllers could hardly process what they were seeing. The alert meant that no commercial aircraft could fly in or out of El Paso. Medical rescue helicopters couldn't either. Business in the city would be disrupted, vacations ruined, lives potentially lost. Pilots who do not adhere to the closure may be intercepted, detained, and interviewed by law enforcement, read the advisory. The United States government could use deadly force against an aircraft if it was determined to pose an imminent security threat. Starting at 11:30 that night, any aircraft that flew over El Paso and its surrounding area below a certain elevation risked being shot down. The controllers, huddling in a tower a dozen stories above the airport's 3 runways, studied a map the FAA had included. It featured a huge red circle encompassing the southern border area where they were standing. An 11-mile diameter, roughly from Sunland Park, New Mexico, to Horizon City, Texas, was now off limits below 18,000 feet. Almost any plane not simply passing far overhead on a long-haul flight was forbidden. And the El Paso airport, demarcated by an airplane avatar, was the bullseye. The first major airspace shutdown since September 11, 2001 had occurred. Sitting in spots they occupied every day in front of their live radar scopes where aircraft appeared as moving dots on a screen, and talking on the radio headsets to pilots, the controllers could only guess at what was happening, recalled one person who was there that night. Had there been a terrorist attack? Was the country battling a Mexican cartel? As it turned out, the U.S. government was at war with itself. The conflict didn't last long, and federal officials quickly moved on. But for the people of El Paso, the episode showed what could happen to a community when federal agencies far away in the nation's capital were at odds. The FAA alert helped explain what had already been a puzzling afternoon. The tower controllers typically spend their shifts keeping aircraft safely separated from one another at or near an airport. But that afternoon, the controllers had also fielded calls from airlines that were asking whether the city's skies were still open. Initially, they found the questions bizarre, but now they made at least some sense, according to someone who was present that evening, but requested anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. The controllers needed to know what was going on. One senior controller called Representative Veronica Escobar, a Texas Democrat whose district includes El Paso, at her Washington apartment. It was 11 p.m. on the East Coast, and the call woke her. She lay in her pajamas, just listening, then abruptly sat up after she heard the controller's news. And there's a picture of Representative Veronica Escobar, whose district includes El Paso. Lacking any hard information, Ms. Escobar mentally ticked through the possibilities. Was the United States at war with Juarez, El Paso's sister city across the border? The military had been attacking boats in the Caribbean, saying they were drug vessels. Maybe now it was attacking Mexico. She also knew the U.S. Army and Customs and Border Protection had been experimenting with lasers meant to shoot down foreign drones. "I was shocked," Ms. Escobar said in an interview. "I was bewildered." She immediately started making her own calls to federal and city leaders. A U.S. Army official told her the Army and Customs and Border Protection had 10 days left in a trial run of the lasers. Maybe the two were related. The controllers in El Paso spent the first hours notifying nearby aviators of the pending closure and steering those already flying toward the ground where they would be safe. One controller began calling medical evacuation services, warning that they would soon be locked out of city airspace, said the person who was present that night. At the same time, this person recalled, another controller was telling pilots they had little time to clear out before the flight restrictions took effect. Some pilots expressed surprise to the controllers over their radios, according to air traffic audio recordings reviewed by the New York Times. Quote, "So is this the first time you've ever heard of anything like this?" one asked. "Shutting down? Yes," the controller answered. "First time for us. We got caught off guard. We're just scrambling now." "I'll bet," the pilot chortled. It seemed that no one in El Paso, with the possible exception of airlines who had called about the rumors swirling that afternoon, had been given a heads up about the shutdown. El Paso's mayor, Renard Johnson, learned about the closure from the city manager, who woke up Mr. Johnson shortly after he switched off the local news and drifted off to sleep. He, too, went on a frantic search for answers. And there's a picture of El Paso Mayor Renard Johnson. The implications were profound. Artificial joints that doctors needed for surgery were often not kept on hand, he knew, and were typically flown in by suppliers a day in advance. The city's fire department, which sometimes dispatched emergency medical workers to far-flung accident sites by helicopter, might not be able to reach injured people quickly enough. Around midnight, University Medical Center of El Paso, the area's only Level 1 trauma center, became aware of the closure from local news reports. Hospital leaders in the area quickly began to talk about how they could help one another, including with air transport. The Southwest Transplant Alliance, an organ procurement group, began exploring how to deliver organs to El Paso by road. The officials who run the airport were also lighting up their phones. "So far, this is no BS," wrote Alexander Rao, the airport's operations manager, in a text message exchange first reported by Politico. "Anyone else to call?" The airport security manager texted Mr. Rao. "FBI?" said Mr. Rao. Answered Mr. Rao. El Pasoans are accustomed to feeling overlooked. They occupy a liberal oasis in a deep red state. 9 hours west of Dallas, El Paso has a rich mix of cultures, making it more of a cultural sibling to Albuquerque than to Midland or Lubbock. And though the city of 680,000 has a respected university and safe neighborhoods, residents complain that it is often dismissed as a crime-ridden desert wasteland. At 12:13 a.m. local time, the El Paso airport announced the closing in a cryptic post on Instagram. Jim Dabrowski, a father of two in a cozy middle-class El Paso neighborhood, found it after seeing a reference to the situation while browsing Reddit. Mr. Dabrowski, who manages a dental practice, wondered if the United States might be at war with Mexico or even under alien invasion. After scanning the local and national news and finding no answers, he briefly considered loading his wife and two young sons into their SUV and driving north to Albuquerque. And there's a picture of passengers waiting after the abrupt closure and reopening of El Paso International Airport and surrounding airspace in February. Quote, "This just seems totally unprecedented. This seems totally mysterious, and there's no explanation from anyone," he remembers thinking. He couldn't think of anybody to call for advice, so after a few hours, he finally turned in. In Santa Teresa, New Mexico, Daniel Manzanares was on the phone, trying to reach his contacts in Customs and Border Protection. Mr. Manzanares, an experienced cattle rancher who runs a livestock trading co-op on the border with Mexico, had received a call from a friend. The man and his wife planned to fly on their own airplane from Santa Teresa Airport to Arizona for a medical appointment the next day, but with the airspace closed, they wouldn't be able to. He asked Mr. Manzanares to find out what was going on. But when Mr. Manzanares called his federal contacts, the calls were inexplicably blocked. The one customs agent Mr. Manzanares did reach said that he could not discuss the matter. "Hey, it's closed," Mr. Manzanares told his friend when he called him back. "Until further notice. Can't tell you what. Don't know." Around that same time, at his residence on the east side of El Paso, Mayor Johnson was working on the talking points for a speech he would give at a news conference in the morning. He was contemplating two versions. He'd give one if the airspace was reopened, an outcome he was pushing for behind the scenes. The other was meant to reassure the public if it was closed. Having spoken to the commanding general of Fort Bliss, the large Army base in the area, he at least felt confident that the military was not mobilizing troops. Quote, "We weren't under any terrorist attack," Mr. Johnson recalled. "We weren't under major threat to the community, so I wanted to make sure that our community could wake up, and live as normal as they could that day." Bianca Marino, a mental health therapist, woke at 5 a.m. to a stream of panicked text messages about whether her group yoga trip to northern India, which had been organized by a local instructor, could still occur. The group's 8 a.m. flight on United Airlines seemed likely to be canceled. They agreed to meet at the airport anyways to come up with a plan B, such as driving 4 hours to Albuquerque Airport to find an alternate flight. At the El Paso airport that morning, airline staff members seemed overwhelmed. "That's all we know," agents told passengers repeatedly. Some resorted to ignoring questions being posed by traveler groups, opting to chat with their colleagues instead. "The scene was very chaotic and confusing," recalled Ms. Marino, who met her group there around 6 a.m., "and there were so many rumors going around about cartel violence spilling over the border or even a national security crisis." Ms. Marino, who treats adults with both trauma and obsessive-compulsive disorder, had her own theory. Quote, "Ever since the Trump administration took office, something crazy like this seemed to happen every single day," she said. "So I just assumed it's just another part of their incompetence and chaotic management going on." Ms. Escobar, the congresswoman, had spent most of the night sitting cross-legged on her bed, using her laptop and 2 phones to connect with El Paso city officials, military contacts, and the FAA. Her staff also reached out to an aide to Susie Wiles, President Trump's chief of staff. In the end, her hunch about drones proved to be right. The Defense Department in recent years had been experimenting with a kind of anti-drone technology that has become an essential part of modern warfare. The Pentagon last year established a joint interagency task force to develop innovative strategies for countering small drone threats. One is the use of anti-drone lasers, which use high-energy beams to shoot down for a fraction of the cost of more traditional technologies. Early on February 9th, the day before the FAA alert was issued, Customs and Border Protection's officials, operating just 16 miles west of the El Paso airport, fired just such a laser weapon in hopes of taking down a foreign object that was flying overhead. Customs and Border Protection had been borrowing the Army's lasers as a new layer of protection against cartel-operated drones from the Mexican side of the border. But this object turned out to be a balloon. Lieutenant Colonel Adam Scher, a spokesman for the Defense Department's Joint Interagency Task Force for Countering Drones, wrote in an email that objects like Mylar balloons have historically been used as decoys by our adversaries for decades to confuse missile defense radar systems, challenge our warfighters, and expend our stockpiles of interceptors. The balloons have also been known to carry drugs, he added. But the use of the weapon surfaced tensions within the U.S. government. The FAA had warned the Pentagon days earlier that using a laser system could pose risks to air safety. When the Department of Defense went ahead anyways, the FAA felt it had no choice but to shut down El Paso's airspace. Eventually, the conflict came to the attention of Ms. Wiles, who intervened. Ms. Escobar said Ms. Wiles did so without returning her staff member's message. At 6:54 a.m., the FAA abruptly announced on X that the airport had reopened. "There is no threat to commercial aviation," the agency stated. "All flights will resume as normal." Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy soon caused more confusion with a comment on X blaming the shutdown on a cartel drone incursion. This was a surprise to Kim Stewart, sheriff of Doña Ana County, New Mexico, next to El Paso County, who said in an interview that she would have known about that if it had happened. "We deal in intel, cross-border intel, every day," Ms. Stewart said. "So what do they think? We're just out to lunch here?" The White House's intervention met a potentially crippling 10 days was limited to less than 8 hours, most of it during the quiet of the night. Southwest Airlines, one of the airport's major carriers, canceled 2 flights and delayed another 8. American Airlines, which also serves El Paso, had 2 cancellations and a half dozen delays. The city did not need to whisk anyone in a medical helicopter from a fire or traffic accident during those hours, and Ms. Marino and her yoga group made it to India on time. And there's a picture of Bianca Marino, a mental health therapist. At 8:30 a.m., Mr. Johnson, wearing a smart gray suit and accompanied by police and emergency management officials, spoke to about 20 local reporters in front of the El Paso City Hall. The closure, he said, should never have happened. The government's failure to communicate with city officials, hospitals, and the airport was unacceptable. Then, looking to reassure the public that it would be a normal day in El Paso, he strolled to a nearby Starbucks and mingled with customers as he purchased a mint tea. Ms. Escobar, Representative Gabe Vasquez, Democrat of New Mexico, and New Mexico's 2 senators have since penned a letter to the Departments of Transportation, Defense, and Homeland Security asking for a classified briefing on the shutdown. In a joint statement from the Department of Defense, Customs and Border Protection, and the FAA, a Pentagon spokesman played down the disruption and emphasized the government's effort to keep America safe. Quote, "At President Trump's direction," the spokesman said, "branches of the government are working together in an unprecedented fashion to mitigate drone threats by Mexican cartels and foreign terrorist organizations at the U.S.-Mexico border. Some in El Paso did not think their government's performance was unprecedented." Quote, It was just like another display of gross incompetence and miscommunication," said Mr. Dombrowski in an interview. "It's disappointing to feel like we're sort of left to fend for ourselves." And there's a picture of the Locust, an anti-drone laser system that had been recently used along the U.S.-Mexican border. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The next headline on today's front page of the New York Times reads, "Immediate results versus the long game. The U.S. and Iran face off." As the United States and Iran make a second attempt at a deal, their negotiating styles are on a collision course, by David E. Sanger. President Trump views himself as a master of coercive diplomacy, forcing his opponents to capitulate quickly to American demands or face the threat of attack. But in dealing with Iran over the past 6 weeks, Mr. Trump has discovered that he is up against a nation that prides itself on resilience and delay. And never has that been more obvious than in recent days, when Mr. Trump has tried jawboning the Iranians by contending they have already surrendered. They agreed to everything, he insisted on Friday, including turning over their nuclear dust, only to discover that patter doesn't work with Iranian officials, who took to social media to declare he had made it all up. So over the next few days, assuming that Vice President J.D. Vance leaves for Islamabad on Tuesday for a second shot at agreeing to a framework deal for a deal, the two approaches are about to come into direct collision. If the stakes were not sky high, the prospect of renewed combat in the Middle East, global energy shortages, and the very real possibilities that surviving Iranian leaders emerge convinced they need a nuclear weapon more than ever, it would be a classic case study in negotiation styles. Quote, "Trump is impulsive and temperamental. Iran's leadership is stubborn and tenacious," said Robert Malley, who negotiated with the Iranians in the lead-up to the 2015 nuclear deal, and again in a failed effort by the Biden administration. Trump demands immediate results. Iran's leadership plays the long game, Mr. Malley continued. Trump insists on a flashy, headline-grabbing outcome. Iran's leadership sweats every detail. Trump believes brute force can compel obedience. Iran's leadership is prepared to endure enormous pain rather than concede on core interests, end quote. There is a reason the last big negotiation, completed 11 years ago, took the better part of 2 years, moving from secret talks with a then-new Iranian president with a pragmatic bent to a full-scale negotiation involving scores of meetings. The final agreement ran more than 160 pages long, including 5 technical annexes that defined the limits of Iran's nuclear activities, the pacing of sanctions relief, and, most importantly, Iran's obligations to comply with inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Every page and most provisions triggered an argument. Just when old issues were resolved and some kind of agreement seemed in place, the Iranian negotiators would arrive with new demands. The Iranians have their own complaints about the Americans. The accord that was ultimately reached, not signed because it was not a formal treaty, in 2015 was overturned by Mr. Trump in 2018. Ever since, the Iranians have made the point that it is pointless to negotiate with one president if the next one is going to scrap the resulting agreement. More recently, Iranian officials have noted that twice in a row, in June 2025 and again this February, Mr. Trump has ordered attacks on Iran in the midst of diplomatic negotiations. The Iranians cast this as perfidy, evidence that Mr. Trump is not a reliable interlocutor. And the distress turned into gunfire over the weekend near the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian boats opened fire on 2 freighters that they said were breaking out of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps' strict control of who can and cannot sail through the strait. On Sunday, a U.S. Navy shot out the engine room of a huge Iranian-flagged container ship, which the Navy has now seized. Mr. Trump noted that the ship had been sanctioned by the Treasury in 2020 at the end of his first term for a prior history of illegal activity. We have full custody of the ship and are seeing what's on board, Mr. Trump wrote on social media. One way to interpret these moves is that they are efforts to shape the negotiating sessions, just as generals try to shape the battlefield. The Iranians are demonstrating that no matter what happens or what they give up, they will be able to control commerce across the strait and charge millions of dollars for passage. The Trump administration is demonstrating that it is willing to reopen hostilities if negotiations fail. Mr. Trump reinforced that point on Sunday, writing that a good deal is on the table. I hope they take it because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy. It was the latest example of how Mr. Trump has veered from complimenting Iran's new leaders, who replaced those killed in the strikes that began February 28th, as more reasonable than their predecessors, to warning them of more violence ahead if he doesn't get his way. But while that is a new element in the talks, the cultural divide in how to negotiate is not. The divide was evident 11 years ago in the gilded halls of the 160-year-old Beau Rivage Palace Hotel in Lausanne, Switzerland, where Secretary of State John Kerry and his counterparts from 5 other countries struggled to close a preliminary agreement with Iran. It was perhaps the closest analog to what is unfolding now in Islamabad. Every day the American delegation would speak about how many centrifuges had to be disassembled and how much uranium needed to be shipped out of the country. Yet when Iranian officials, including Abbas Araghchi, now the Iranian foreign minister, stepped out of the elegant chandeliered rooms to brief reporters, most of the questions about those details were waved away. The Iranians talked about preserving respect for their rights and Iran's sovereignty. Quote, I remember we finally got the parameters agreed upon at the hotel, Wendy Sherman, the chief U.S. negotiator at the time, said on Monday. And then a few days later, the Supreme Leader came out and said, actually, some very different terms were required. Ms. Sherman, who went on to become Deputy Secretary of State in the Biden administration, would go into these negotiations with a large posse. She often had the CIA's top Iran expert in the room or nearby. So was the Energy Secretary, Ernest Moniz, an expert in nuclear weapon design. Proposals floated by the Iranians would be sent back to the U.S. national laboratories, where weapons are designed and tested for expert analysis of whether the agreements being discussed would keep Iran at least a year away from a bomb. But Mr. Trump's negotiating team travels light, with no entourage of experts and few briefings. Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, the president's son-in-law, and the special envoy, learned their negotiating skills in New York real estate and say a deal is a deal. They say they've immersed themselves in the details of the Iran program and know it well. Moreover, even if the issues they are facing are very much the same ones that the Obama-era negotiators faced, Mr. Kushner and Mr. Witkoff see little value in spending hours poring over the diplomatic history, especially given what Mr. Trump had to say about the resulting agreement. But Mr. Trump is clearly sensitive about the coming comparisons. Quote, "The deal we are making with Iran is far better than JCPOA," he said, using the acronym for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the formal name for the 2015 accord. It was a guaranteed road to a nuclear weapon, which will not and cannot happen with the deal we're working on. And with that, Mr. Trump set up the test that his own negotiation, if successful, may be measured by. The next headline in today's New York Times front page reads, "Trump extends ceasefire even as peace talks are put on hold." With the ceasefire on the verge of ending, President Trump said on Tuesday that he would keep it in place until Iran's proposal is submitted and discussions are concluded one way or the other. By Jonathan Swan, Maggie Haberman, Eliane Peltier, and Fernaz Fasihi. President Trump said on Tuesday that he was extending a ceasefire with Iran that had been about to expire, even as Vice President J.D. Vance's trip to Pakistan for a second round of negotiations with Iran was put on hold after Tehran failed to respond to American positions. Mr. Trump said on social media that, at the request of Pakistan's leadership, the ceasefire would stay in effect until Iran's proposal is submitted and discussions are concluded one way or the other. The president, however, said the U.S. military would continue to blockade Iranian ports. That stance appeared to be a major sticking point for Iran. The country's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said on social media earlier on Tuesday that the blockade was an act of war and thus a violation of the ceasefire. Although the 2-week truce, which had been set to end on Wednesday in Iran, was extended, it was unclear what steps Iran or the United States would take next. Mr. Vance, who had been expected to travel to Pakistan on Tuesday morning, was staying in Washington to attend additional policy meetings, a White House official said. The official spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss potential scheduling. A spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry, Ismail Baghai, said Iran had not decided whether to send its negotiator to Pakistan. Mr. Baghai blamed contradictory messages, inconsistent behavior, and unacceptable actions by the American side, according to Iran's state broadcaster IRIB. In private, 2 senior Iranian officials had said Monday that Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commander and Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, would attend negotiations in Pakistan if Mr. Vance were there. As recently as Tuesday morning, Mr. Vance had still been planning to travel to Pakistan. But because Iran had given no response to the Trump administration's negotiating positions, the U.S. official said the diplomatic process was in effect paused. The talks could be back on at a moment's notice if Iran's negotiators respond in a way that Mr. Trump deems acceptable. U.S. officials were also looking for a clear sign that Iran's negotiators had been fully empowered to reach an agreement. The delay was another hurdle in the Trump administration's push to secure an agreement that would curb Iran's nuclear program, and it came as U.S. forces remained poised to launch another wave of strikes on Iran, having maintained their substantial presence in the Middle East. Even if the sides returned to the negotiating table, many sticking points remain on Iran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz, a strategic conduit for oil and gas off Iran's southern coast. The threat of Iranian attacks has throttled ship traffic through the strait, prompting an American blockade of Iranian ports that the U.S. Navy says has forced 28 ships to turn around. The United States has recently transmitted a written proposal to the Iranians intended to establish baseline points of agreement that could frame more detailed negotiations. The document covered a broad range of issues, but the core sticking points were the same ones that have bedeviled Western negotiators for more than a decade. The scope of Iran's uranium enrichment program and the fate of its stockpile of enriched uranium. It's unclear what exactly the United States has proposed or what the president would be willing to accept. The American position could range from demanding that Iran abandon enrichment entirely to allowing a limited civilian program under strict oversight by the International Atomic Energy Agency, paired with the closure of Iran's underground nuclear facilities. One of the ideas discussed during negotiations last year was a multinational consortium working with Iran to enrich uranium for civilian uses. Potential locations included an island in the Persian Gulf. Regarding that stockpile, negotiators are weighing options, including whether Iran should surrender its enriched uranium directly to the United States or transfer it to a third country. Also on the table is what the United States might offer in return. Iran has hundreds of billions of dollars in assets frozen under American sanctions as part of Mr. Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and administration officials are debating whether releasing some of those funds could be part of the final deal. Officials have also discussed whether the United States and Persian Gulf partners such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates might offer broader economic integration to Iran. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mr. Trump has been adamant in private conversations that his deal must be better than the one struck by President Barack Obama in 2015. Knowing that, Iran hawks close to the president have repeatedly invoked Mr. Obama's deal as a tactic to keep him from agreeing to what they view as dangerous concessions. Any American position on enrichment will have to contend with Iran's long-standing argument, rooted in its accession to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that the pact guarantees signatories the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. The pause in talks capped a turbulent few days of public messaging from Mr. Trump, whose statements have at times appeared at odds with the state of negotiations. In a telephone interview with CBS News on Friday, Mr. Trump declared that Iran had agreed to everything and described a joint operation to remove Iranian nuclear material. Our people, together with the Iranians, are going to work together to go get it, and will take it to the United States, he said. Iranian officials quickly disputed that characterization. Then on Sunday, Mr. Trump wrote on Truth Social that Iran had violated the ceasefire by firing on commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, including a French ship and a British freighter. That same day, U.S. military forces seized an Iranian-flagged ship, the Tuska, that Mr. Trump had said tried to evade the blockade on the country's ports. On Tuesday, the U.S. military stopped and boarded a tanker in the Indian Ocean that was carrying oil from Iran, the Pentagon said. It was the latest effort by the Trump administration to squeeze Iran's oil-reliant economy since the United States and Israel began attacking Iran on February 28th. Quote, "We will pursue global maritime enforcement efforts to disrupt illicit networks and interdict sanctioned vessels providing material support to Iran anywhere they operate," the Defense Department said in a statement that included a video that appeared to show Navy SEALs landing by helicopter on the ship, the MT Tiffany. The Pentagon added that it would continue to deny illicit actors and their vessels freedom of maneuver in the maritime domain. With the MT Tiffany now at least temporarily in the custody of the military, a U.S. military official said it was up to the White House to decide what to do with the sanctioned vessel and its cargo, which the official said was in the Bay of Bengal. In Lebanon, more fighting between Israel and Hezbollah, a militia backed by Iran, threatened a 10-day ceasefire announced by Israel and the Lebanese government last week. Hezbollah confirmed on Tuesday that it had fired rockets and drones into northern Israel in what it said was a response to Israeli violations of the ceasefire. The Israeli military has kept up its strike against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, citing a right to self-defense as outlined in the truce. The next headline on today's front page of the New York Times reads, Fed pick faces skepticism over claim of independence from Trump. Kevin Warsh's nomination to lead the Federal Reserve could still be delayed by a Justice Department investigation into the current chair, Jerome H. Powell, by Colby Smith. Kevin M. Warsh, President Trump's pick to lead the Federal Reserve, asserted repeatedly at a combative confirmation hearing on Tuesday that he would not cut interest rates simply because President Trump wanted him to, pledging to be strictly independent if confirmed for one of the world's most powerful economic positions. In sometimes testy exchanges before the Senate Banking Committee, Mr. Warsh, 56, sought to dispel doubts around his credibility, saying Mr. Trump had never asked me to predetermine, commit, fix, decide on any interest rate decision in any of our discussions, nor would I have ever agreed to do so. He was repeatedly asked if he would function as a sock puppet for Mr. Trump, who has demanded lower rates from the Fed and attacked the institution's top leadership for failing to cut them aggressively enough. Just hours before the hearing, Mr. Trump said in an interview with CNBC that he would be disappointed if Mr. Warsh did not reduce borrowing costs once confirmed as Fed chair. Mr. Warsh, who served as a Fed governor from 2006 to 2011, said he would remain independent. In his opening statement, he said that central bankers must be strong enough to listen to a diversity of views from all corners, humble enough to be open-minded to new ideas and new economic developments, wise enough to translate imperfect data into meaningful insight, and dedicated enough to make judgments faithfully and wisely. But as several lawmakers on Tuesday noted, Mr. Trump's broadsides against the Fed have gone well beyond just verbal arguments. He is in the midst of trying to remove Lisa D. Cook, a governor appointed by the Biden administration, from her position over unsubstantiated allegations of mortgage fraud. The Supreme Court has yet to rule on the case, but so far the justices seem wary about allowing Ms. Cook's ousting to hold given concerns about the Fed's independence. The Justice Department has also initiated a criminal investigation into Mr. Powell and his handling of renovations at the Fed's headquarters in Washington, which has thrown a wrench into Mr. Warsh's ability to get confirmed before Mr. Powell's term as chair ends on May 15th. That's because Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, a Republican on the Banking Committee, has vowed to block any attempt to confirm a new Fed chair until the legal threats against Mr. Powell are resolved. While Mr. Tillis said he believed Mr. Warsh was qualified for the job, he has blasted the investigation as a blatant attempt to coerce Mr. Powell into lowering rates, undermining the Fed's independence and confirming the politicization of the Justice Department. Quote, "The problem that I have here is that we had some U.S. attorney with a dream, or assistant U.S. attorney, thinking it would be cute to bring Chair Powell under investigation just a few months before the position was going to open," Mr. Tillis said on Tuesday. "Let's get rid of this investigation so I can support your nomination," he added. Mr. Trump on Tuesday showed no indication that he wanted the Justice Department to drop the investigation, despite numerous legal setbacks. Quote, You have to find out why a thing like that could happen," he said of the central bank's renovations. "I'm afraid Kevin will have to have an office next to me in the White House because that building is not going to be done," end quote. Mr. Powell has said he will stay on as chair on a temporary basis if Mr. Warsh is not confirmed by May 15th. He has yet to disclose whether he will stay on as a governor, as he can do until 2028. Mr. Warsh also came under fire from Democrats, who questioned his shifting views on inflation. While at the Fed over a decade ago, Mr. Warsh was known as an inflation hawk, who often argued against lowering rates for fear that it could stoke price pressures. While campaigning to be chair, Mr. Warsh embraced the need for rate cuts, arguing that there was a path for lower borrowing costs because of his plans to shrink the Fed's holdings of Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. That would likely lead to higher long-term rates that then could be offset by lowering the short-term rates that the Fed controls, he has said. Mr. Warsh also argued that higher productivity from the boom in artificial intelligence could unleash higher growth without stoking inflation, which could give the Fed more space to lower rates than otherwise would be the case. Mr. Warsh reiterated those arguments on Tuesday, despite some pushback from lawmakers, including Senator John Kennedy, Republican from Louisiana, who described promises of AI-driven productivity gains as hype from people trying to draw up interest for their coming initial public offerings. Mr. Warsh repeatedly made clear on Tuesday that he views any overshoot of inflation as the Fed's fault, as he criticized the central bank for missing its 2% inflation target since the pandemic. Quote, There's an indication that the Fed missed its mark, and we are still dealing with the legacy of the policy errors in 2021 and 2022, said Mr. Warsh, referring to a period in which policymakers were slow to respond to mounting price pressure caused by gummed-up supply chains and a series of economic rescue packages from the government. Quote, "Once you let inflation take hold in the economy, it's more expensive and harder to bring down." On Tuesday, he pushed back on the idea that tariffs had worsened inflation and said that the Fed needed regime change in the conduct of policy. It means a new and different inflation framework. Mr. Warsh touched on other changes he would support if confirmed, including how the Fed communicates around its policy decisions. Mr. Warsh criticized the amount of public forecasting the Fed does, suggesting that the institution should provide fewer hints about the future to avoid boxing officials in. On Tuesday, he criticized the dot plot that the Fed releases 4 times a year, which most importantly conveys to Wall Street where the Fed sees the rates in the future. Quote, "The Fed tells the whole world what their dots are going to be, what their forecasts are going to be. Well, the Fed's human, and then they hold on to those forecasts longer than they should," he said. Mr. Warsh demurred when asked how many policy meetings a year there would be if he is confirmed as chair. He said that while the Federal Reserve Act requires a minimum of 4 interest rate meetings per year, that was too few. He did not provide an answer about whether he would continue to hold news conferences, which take place after each of the 8 interest rate meetings that are currently held. If confirmed, Mr. Warsh's ascent would mark a homecoming for the Wall Street financier. The global financial crisis dominated Mr. Warsh's first tenure at the Fed, thrusting him into the middle of discussions about how the central bank should respond to the threat of bank failures, turmoil in financial markets, and the painful recession that followed. Mr. Warsh, then the youngest ever member of the Board of Governors, was initially supportive of the Fed's efforts to shore up financial markets by buying enormous quantities of government bonds and expanding its balance sheet to ease strains in financial markets and support growth by keeping market-based rates low. But he soon soured on subsequent effort to buy more bonds and resigned in protest, arguing at the time that the Fed was distorting financial markets and relying too much on a tool with uncertain economic implications. Some of the most heated exchanges came during questioning by Senator Elizabeth Warren, a Massachusetts Democrat and ranking member. Mr. Warsh declined to directly answer when asked whether Mr. Trump had lost the 2020 election, a question Ms. Warren suggested was a factual test of his independence. Quote, "We try to keep politics, if I'm confirmed, out of the Federal Reserve," Mr. Warsh said at one point during the exchange. She and other Democrats also pressed Mr. Warsh about the more than $100 million in assets that he has agreed to divest if he is confirmed. His financial disclosures did not include specific details about several of his current holdings, including 2 roughly $50 million stakes in the Juggernaut Fund, which is tied to billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller, with whom Mr. Warsh was working closely before being nominated as chair. Mr. Warsh said that confidentiality agreements had prevented him from providing those details, and that, if he was confirmed, his investments would be as plain vanilla as possible and sitting in something like cash. Ms. Warren asked Mr. Warsh if his assets included entities involving the president and his family, Chinese-affiliated businesses, or investments related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Mr. Warsh grew increasingly frustrated during the exchange, during which he only responded that he had agreed to sell all of my financial assets. The next headline on today's front page reads, "How the Coal Disaster Drove the U.S. to Develop New Warship Defenses." The Navy destroyers enforcing a blockade of Iranian ports carry weapons fielded after an American warship was attacked and nearly sunk more than 25 years ago. And there's a picture of the damaged destroyer USS Cole being taken out of the port of Aden by tugboats after it was attacked in October of 2000. This article is by Nicholas Coolish, John Ismay, and Constant Mehut. The American destroyer off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula was taken unawares by a small fiberglass skiff with 2 men on board. Before the crew knew what had happened, an explosion tore a hole 40 feet wide in the hull, killing 17 crew members and wounding 39 others. That was in 2000, and the ship was the USS Cole, which narrowly avoided sinking after the devastating attacks by suicide bombers from a group most Americans had never heard of at the time, Al-Qaeda, using a small boat laden with explosives at the port of Aden in Yemen. It was a pivotal attack on the United States by members of Al-Qaeda before its 9/11 assault a year later, at a time when most Americans were not focused on terrorism. The lessons the U.S. Navy learned from that episode, in which an inexpensive boat nearly sank a $789 million destroyer, could help determine how its ships fare a quarter-century later near the Strait of Hormuz in the war with Iran. Iran has established a chokehold on transit through the critical waterway, threatening destruction to any ship that tries to pass through without its permission. In response, the U.S. has moved in a flotilla of ships, including about a dozen Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, patrolling the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea south of the strait. The aim is to further pressure the Iranian economy by blocking oil exports from Iranian ports. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Tehran has issued a series of bellicose warnings since the war started, laying naval mines in the strait, and on Saturday, 2 Indian-flagged ships reported coming under fire. The U.S. added to the hostilities on Sunday when a Navy destroyer attacked and seized an Iranian cargo ship that U.S. officials said had defied their blockade. One major question facing the American military is this: if the standoff on the seas turns into a military clash, will the changes made in response to the Cole disaster enable the U.S. military to repel any new attacks from the Iranians? The U.S. Navy now has multiple options for defending its ships, analysts say. Following the Cole attack, Navy leadership created a task force called Hip Pocket to develop a range of new defensive weapons. They quickly added more automatic weapons to warships as well as grenade launchers. And the current generation of Seahawk helicopters carried by Navy destroyers have advanced sensors and weapons that are far superior to those when the Cole was attacked. And there's a picture of a Seahawk helicopter on an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer in Puerto Rico. Still, said Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, in the narrow confines in and around the Strait of Hormuz, a swarm attack by unmanned maritime drones could be hard to defend against. The problem is, you may have more than you can handle, 30, 40 drone boats. You're not going to get all of them with guns, Mr. Clark said. Some may leak through. The evolution of naval warfare has been on daily display in Ukraine, where the Russian fleet lost numerous ships to a mix of anti-ship missiles and unmanned sea drones. In April 2022, Ukrainian forces sank the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, starting fires and flooding that quickly put the vessel on the seafloor. Over time, Russian ships were forced to retreat to safer ports as Ukraine drove Moscow's once feared navy mostly out of the fight. Iran has been paying close attention, experts say, and also learning from its proxies in Yemen, the Houthis, a militant group that used a remote-control boat packed with explosives to attack a Saudi frigate in 2017, killing 2. Quote, the U.S. Navy took note of that as an important technological development with regard to the ability of weaker adversaries to attack stronger ones at sea, said Michael B. Peterson, senior fellow at the Policy Research Institute of the Houthi attack. Iran does not have the resources to develop an advanced navy to take on the U.S. head-on, but they do have resources to build large swarms of small boats, Mr. Peterson said. Experts said the American decision to situate destroyers in the Gulf of Oman points to a degree of caution among senior military leaders, keeping their warships far enough away from the strait to give them the best odds of countering potential Iranian attacks, while at the same time staying close enough to screen ships trying to enter or leaving Iranian ports. If U.S. vessels tried to venture through the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran could quickly launch attacks, it would swiftly become a riskier proposition. During a briefing to reporters at the Pentagon on Thursday morning, General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said American warplanes and surveillance aircraft were flying over the Navy destroyers, enforcing the blockade. He showed a chart of the Gulf of Oman that included the rough locations of the ships. The dozen Burke-class destroyers pictured were more than 400 miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 150 miles south from the nearest point of Iranian land. Perhaps a tacit admission that the Navy wanted to keep its ships far enough away to better detect and defend against any attack launched from Iran. Quote, if they were confident that this anti-Navy was no longer a threat, they might have established a close blockade, which can secure tight control over a limited area, but carries enhanced tactical risks, Mr. Peterson said. Iran has built up a stockpile of anti-ship cruise missiles, which are launched from the back of trucks and can skim the wave tops as they approach a targeted vessel. For a warship close to shore, the amount of time to detect and engage such a missile is greatly reduced, and the Iranian launchers can be extremely difficult to locate. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps also has a Mosquito fleet of small, agile, fast boats that specialize in hit-and-run attacks. And Iran can launch aerial drones like the Shahed that have featured so prominently in this conflict, either from boats or from land, as well as explosive-laden unmanned maritime drones. The U.S. Navy has added new capabilities that may offer its warships a better chance of survival than the Russians have succeeded in implementing in Ukraine so far. After the attack on the Cole, the Navy initially rushed more automatic weapons to the fleet, and by 2007 it had settled on a mix of twin 7.62 millimeter and 50 caliber machine guns to boost the short-range firepower of its warships. The Navy also developed two new 5-inch diameter shells for the largest guns that destroyers and cruisers carry, designed specifically for attacking smaller, more nimble boats at a range of several miles. Those shells were optimized for these kinds of attacks by creating a shotgun-like effect of tungsten pellets to shred incoming attackers. Quote, the U.S. has been operating in the Persian Gulf, dealing with terrorist threats for a long time, preparing to a degree more than Russians have, said Mr. Clark of the Hudson Institute, who served in the Navy headquarters staff from 2004 to 2011. The U.S. could use its arsenal of Reaper drones orbiting over ships to provide advanced warning of boat swarms approaching. If armed, the drones could be picking off boats with small guided missiles and 500-pound bombs. The drones could also surveil Iranian boats that may be carrying naval mines and mark the locations of any mines that are laid in the sea. One challenge is that those drones are launched from airfields on land and could potentially be too far away to effectively respond in an emergency. For situations like those, destroyers can quickly launch their Seahawk helicopters to intercept an incoming vessel and engage it with Hellfire missiles and small laser-guided rockets. With the ability to fly nearly 300 miles from a ship and return, those armed helicopters greatly extend a warship's ability to actively defend itself before shipboard weapons become necessary. Another headline in today's New York Times front page reads, a composer who loops musical time and history. Gregory Spears is bringing his uncanny sense of genre and eras of music to the Sleeping Beauty story with his new opera, Sleepers Awake, by Joshua Barone, visuals by Michelle Gustafson. At the end of Sleepers Awake, Gregory Spears' new operatic spin on Sleeping Beauty, chorus singers gather to celebrate the fairy tale's happy couple who join in with soaring voices. But they're all so spirited they exhaust themselves into another mass slumber. Audience members may feel like they've seen this before, just a half hour ago, actually. The story's climax is an echo of its midpoint, in which everyone on stage drifts back to sleep after a heroic stranger wakes them up. It seems as if the opera has shown two turns of a cycle that could go on forever. Time is a funny, enigmatic thing in Sleepers Awake, and the same could be said about much of Spears's work. He has dramatized the passage of time, but also looped it into sculpture and space. His sound flattens music history into a single plane shared by medieval song, minimalism, and more. Even his remarkably boyish appearance as he nears 49 seems to defy the norms of time passing. Still, as the years go by, Spears has steadily carved out a place for himself in American music, with a schedule that speaks for itself. Sleepers Awake, which premieres on Wednesday at Opera Philadelphia, follows the recent premiere of another piece, Secrets, at the Frick Collection. And the 10th anniversary of his popular adaptation of Fellow Travelers is being observed with a national tour that continues this summer at San Diego Opera and the Glimmerglass Festival in Cooperstown, New York. You can trace a direct line from those works to his earliest experiences with music while growing up in Virginia. As a child, learning piano, Spears was fascinated by the way scores, he said in an interview, opened a whole world that was different from ours. There was something about being able to play a piece of music, he added, and feeling like you're actually recreating some sort of ceremony or ritual from years and years ago. When he started to write music as a teenager, he was attracted to the way an abstract art form like this could allow him to express, yet conceal himself. Spears describes himself as a weird kid who was also gay and didn't want to be judged for it. Composing provided an outlet for both his emotions and his athletic skills at the keyboard. As he moved on to a prestigious education, first at the Eastman School of Music, then in programs at Yale and Princeton, he found himself working to reconcile two incompatible loves, for Gustav Mahler's profuse post-romantic style and for Steve Reich's time-suspending minimalism. Quote, minimalism is about trying to take a moment and preserve it for eternity, about how to turn a musical moment into space, Spears said. Mahler has moments of that, but it is otherwise profoundly different. So, I was grappling with this contradiction. How could I love these things in the same place? That question has shaped Spears' artistry along with a fondness for complexity and mystery. He was also awed while writing his Requiem, 2010, by hearing the voice of Ruth Cunningham from the quartet Anonymous Four. Quote, it sounds like I'm listening to a 13th century troubadour singer or a nun, and at the same time it sounds like a synthesizer, he said. To me, that's beautiful because it's deeply mysterious and contradictory and paradoxical. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 22nd, 2026 issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been David Frothingham. Thank you for listening.